Well, I'm going to try to keep my comments focused on the important issues, and that is on the myths about the U.S. economy and the state of the U.S. economy that prevail now. I'd like to debunk some of those myths for you. Most of you probably, when you hear that, oh, the economy is doing so great, and of course that's the famous quote from Donald, right? Well, wait a minute, it's not doing so great for me. I don't feel that it's so great. In fact, there was just a poll that came out by the Financial Times and the Peterson Institute, which is a big think tank for big finance capital, right? And the findings were that 65% of Americans polled felt either nothing had improved under Trump or it's gotten worse. 65%. Things are no better and worse. Well, you know, if the economy is doing so great, why is 2/3 of the people feel that way? So, you know, it kind of suggests there's a disjoint here between what you hear from not just Trump, but the corporate media, too. You know, and that's not just Fox News, but of course that's New York Times, that's Wall Street Journal. It's everything that you hear from. We keep hearing these Pollyanna, you know, things are so great, but they're really not so great for most folks, as I'll try to explain if you go below the surface a little bit. Okay. Well, you know, they say we have a gross domestic product of $20.6 trillion here last year. It's going to be about 21.5 or 2 or something like that this year. Okay. The year before Trump came in office is 1.6 growth. Now, GDP is all the goods and services produced and sold in a given year or a quarter. They look at it in a quarter and they look at it in a year. And that's an indication of, you know, the health, the growth of the economy, right? 1.6% when he came into office. It had been about 1.7, 1.8 throughout the whole Obama period, which was about 60% of what's normal during a recovery from a recession, you know, 2008-9 being the Great Recession. Usually it grows more than that, but under Obama, it was kind of a very sluggish recovery, and 1.6% was about the average it had been. Well, Trump said things were so bad, you know, he was going to do so much to turn it around, and well, you know, it increased a little bit, 2.4% in 17, 2.9, but this year it's going to be 1.7. Well, it's slowing down again, and that's after a $4 trillion tax cut that Trump introduced in 2018. Yeah, it was $4 trillion, not $1.5 trillion, because of some phony assumptions about growth, and he didn't count the fact that U.S. multinational corporations were going to get $2 trillion over the next decade. That wasn't factored in at all. So it's really $4 trillion, and after $4 trillion, the economy is slowing down again, back down to the average that it was during Obama. Okay, so we're going to debunk that growth rate a little bit, and we're also going to debunk what you hear about the unemployment rate, 3.6%. Oh, wow, is that way off? And I'll explain how. And then inflation, only 1.4%. Anybody believe that? I got a bridge I'll sell you if you do. And then the wage increase we hear, 3.1% wage increase, right? All right. Apart from the fact that 60% of Americans didn't get any wage increase at all last year, somehow 3.1%. Okay, gross domestic product. I don't want to get too academic here, but to understand, there's 4 categories that comprise GDP, as we call it, which is the indication of how well the economy is doing. If it's growing, GDP is growing. Right? It should be growing 2.5%, 3%. As I said, it's really growing about 1.7 for some years now. Okay, so consumption is 70% of that GDP. Business investment is about 10, 12%. Government spending is another 20%, and then exports minus imports, which are negative, and that's how you get to 100%, whatever the GDP number is. All right? So we'll come back to that GDP and those categories. Which of those categories are really growing and not? Because we want to talk about at the end of the presentation whether we're in a recession or near a recession, about to have a recession. You know, if you listen to the media, of course, we're nowhere near that. But I want to emphasize the flip side of GDP. For all the goods and services made and sold in this country, somebody gets an income. And the flip side is called gross domestic income. Now, who does that go to is the question. Who gets the lion's share of gross domestic income? In other words, who's benefiting from the GDP mostly? Well, if you look at the main categories there, corporate profits, something called business income, which is really non-corporate business, proprietors, partnerships, and so forth. That's business income. Interest, bank interest, net interest, rents, and then we have wages and salaries, makes up all the rest. Of course, wages and salaries are overestimated because 65% of proprietors' business income is considered wages. If you're self-employed, you have a small business, the government says 65% of everything you make is really wages. It's not profits. So that's how they lower the amount of business income and boost the wage totals. And of course, we got CEO and senior manager pay and bonuses and lump sum payments, deferred and so forth. That also goes into wages. I'm trying to give you a class analysis here. You know, who of the capitalists, you know, which are corporations, business owners, banks, renters, and so forth, how much are they getting of everything produced every year, and how much do we, wage earners, if you got a job, do we get? Okay. It's important to understand that corporate profits, business income, rents from banks, includes leasing and so forth, these are conduits. Think of them as conduits in which the GDP income is distributed to the wealthiest 1%, and maybe 5%, 10%. Those who don't really work for someone else, although many of them do, those who, you know, make their income from capital gains, make their income from stock investing, from bond investing, from foreign currency exchange speculation, from commodities, derivatives, all the rest. That's where they make their income from. We call those capital incomes. And profits and business income, these are the conduits. And I'll explain how the production gets funneled through these institutions, corporations and so forth, to the wealthiest 1 or 5%. And of course, the wealthiest 1 or 5% then take that amount that they got from their corporations, their institutions, and they play with it. They reinvest it as well. You know, they don't just put it in the bank and sit on it. You know, they take that amount that they get distributed, and I'll show you how much, and they reinvest it in the stock market. They reinvest it in bond markets, in currency exchange, and so forth, around the world. You see, the finance sector is global now. There's no such thing as a domestic finance. No such thing as domestic banks anymore. It's global. We have a new finance capital elite, as I call them, that sit on top of the economy and are making really the super profits. And they're running the government, too. You know, who's running the economic policies of the Trump administration? Goldman Sachs. Investment bank, or what we call a shadow bank, you know? Shadow bank because they're not really a commercial bank like J.P. Morgan, Chase, or Wells. You know, they're unregulated, wheeling, dealing, speculating, taking big risks, making big money, and taking big busts when they happen. The 2008-9 crash was with the shadow banks. They dragged everything down. You know, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, all those were shadow banks, we call them. And they hold more assets now than the commercial banks, you know, the typical thing you think of when you think of a bank, the shadow banks, right? Well, they're the institutions of the new finance capital elite. You know, there's about 200,000 of these finance capital elite around the world. You hear their names once in a while, you know, Paul Singer and Elliott and so forth, Adelson. These are the guys who just invest in different financial markets around the world. There's about 200,000 of them. You have to be in that category, you have to make $50 million in income a year minimum. 50 million, not assets, but income from your assets to be in that club. Well, you know, they make money on top of the money they get distributed to them. Okay, just to give you a little peek of how much they're making here, let's just take the Fortune 500 corporations, the largest 500 corporations in the U.S., called Fortune 500. There's 2 million corporations in the U.S., and there's 7 million non-corporate business companies, proprietorships, partnerships, all right, about 9 million. Okay, for just the largest 500 corporations, how much have they been getting since the recession, or distributing, rather, I should say, distributing of their profits to their shareholders? How much have they been distributing? In the form of just stock buybacks or dividend payouts. I mean, Apple Corporation is sitting on a cash hoard of $250 billion. You know? And they distribute 10, 20, 30 billion all the time to their shareholders by buying back stocks or paying out dividends. Well, the tech companies mostly buy back their stocks. Well, if you look at in 2000, the year 2000, stock buybacks and dividends from the Fortune 500 was 380 billion. By 2007, 800 billion. Under Obama, you know, we had the crisis and it dipped a little bit, right, in 2012, but then it went up to 2014, 900 billion, 2016, you know, to 17 here, about 900 billion a year. It's going up every year to $1 trillion. And in the last 2 years under Trump, it's been well over $1 trillion. This is actual, you know, let's sign the checks and give it to them. Right, to our shareholders. Let's send them this money. And then, of course, they take the money, these wealthy folks, and they reinvest it in the stock market, drive it up even more in bond markets, properties, and so forth. Right? So, you know, it's $1.3 trillion. If you look at this, it's like $1 trillion a year for the last 8 years. $8 trillion just in the Fortune 500 companies been distributed to their shareholders. Right? Well, Trump is right. It's the greatest economy in the world for them. Okay. But there are other conduits as well here. Remember, there's 2 million corporations, and they, of course, are distributing buybacks and dividends and so forth. You know, I can't get my figure on that, how much that is, but, you know, estimate roughly with the interest and dividend income from bonds and assets, about another $2 trillion. 7 million non-corporate business entities, proprietorships, and their wages, you know, over $1 trillion, 1.6. Then you got rental income, royalties, CEO senior management pay, and then capital gains on top of that from speculating in stocks, derivatives, and so forth. So we get the wealthiest 1%. You heard that term a lot, right? We're the 99, they're the 1. And this is where the lion's share of all this goes to. You know, it doesn't go, I mean, it even goes to the 1/10 of 1%, even more, and the 1/100th of 1%, even more. But, you know, the top 5%, they get a taste of that too. And maybe it dribbles down into the 8, 9%. But from the bottom 90%, you know, we're all wage earners, you know. Maybe you got a little bit in your 401k and you make a little bit, and then the crisis comes and everybody with 401k has lost $4 trillion, you know, from the crisis of 2008 and 9. Okay, so to be in the club of the 1%, the threshold to get there, to be part of it, is $460,000 a year in income, not in assets and ownership, but just in income. In other words, the assets throw off the income. They generate the income, and with the income you buy more assets, stocks and bonds that generate more income. So the more income you got, the more assets you get, the more income you get from the assets that you bought. 22% share of all the national income. Remember the $20.6 trillion? You know, the national income after capital accumulation, depreciation, about 16 trillion. So 22% of that 16 trillion goes to the 1%. You know, 45% real income gain for this group during Clinton. A 65% income gain for this group during George W. Bush. During the recession, the income gain was 91%. Well, wait a minute, they were supposed to lose money, right? How did they gain 91%? Okay, well, that's because they lost some for about 9 months or 12 months, and then they gained it all back real quick by 2010, and gained even more in 11 and 12 because of the policies of the Obama administration, which was really throw tax cuts at these guys, extend the Bush tax cuts. We've given corporate and investors and businesses since 2001 under George W. Bush $15 trillion in tax cuts. George Bush gave them $3.8 trillion. Obama comes along, extends the Bush tax cuts for 2 years for another $900 billion, gives them $800 billion more, and then extends the Bush tax cuts in 2013 for another decade for $5 trillion. And then we get Trump on top of that, who during his campaign promised $5 trillion in tax cuts. And, he came pretty close. He gave him another $4 trillion. $15 trillion in tax cuts. About another $7 trillion in war and defense spending. There's your budget deficit of $22 trillion today. It's tax cuts, slow growth, which also lowers your tax revenue, and it's defense spending. And, throw a little bit in there with the health insurance companies and pharma companies gouging us and gouging Medicare and Medicaid and so forth. That's a little bit of it there, but it pales against the other two causes. Well, the bottom 99% of us, since the recession, 2009, ended, supposedly, 8.7% income growth. The rest of us got 8.7%. They got 95%. Well, wait, how is this happening? Well, it's not all because minimum wages aren't rising, that's for sure, although that's part of it, right? There's lots of reasons, policy reasons. I started talking about this way back in 2006 in my book, The War at Home, where I documented how was it that we get $1 trillion being shifted every year from wage incomes to capital incomes. Most academics have been talking about income inequality, and they give you the final number. But how many of them, whether it's Stigler or this guy Krugman or whatever, they all write books about this, or Robert Reich, they all write books about this, but none of them tell you how it was done, do they? They just tell you how bad it is and well, we know how bad it is, but how did they pull this off? That's the real question. Well, it's because of the policies that have been enacted under neoliberalism, as we call it, which was the big capitalist restructuring around the time Reagan came in. Actually, it started under Carter. How they restructured their policies, fiscal policy, monetary policy, industrial trade policy, to make sure of two things. One, that the challenges that were beginning to arise domestically in the 1970s, and I lived through them as a union organizer and a union president, and I remember how when we would go on strike and win, we would win 25% increase in wages and benefits in the first year of a 3-year contract. 25%. There was a strike wave in 70-71 that the capitalists could not stop. It started in construction unions, then the Teamsters, who deliver to the construction sites, caught fire, and then the auto workers and steel workers and longshore workers. They couldn't stop this strike wave in these big increases, so Nixon, the president at the time, froze wages. That's the only way they could do it. And then they went on a campaign to destroy the unions, which went into high gear when Reagan came into office, and they've been decimating the unions ever since, and we're just a shadow of what we once were. Well, that's a little bit digression. Neoliberalism and its origins. It was the crisis of the 1970s where it begins, and it's been evolving ever since. But neoliberalism hit a fan in 2008-9, and Obama couldn't resurrect Humpty Dumpty. It was too broken. And you got to understand that Trump is the response to the failure of Obama to restructure and restore neoliberal policies and keep the game going. And it's not only neoliberalism, it's not only designed to attack domestic challengers like, unions and workers, but the 70s, everybody was moving. I wish some of you lived in the 70s, and you know what it was. And boy, this is another world we're in today, although people are beginning to wake up a little. Right? But neoliberalism is also about U.S. capitalists checking the challenges from abroad, from other capitalists. It's also about assuring that U.S. capital maintains its hegemony for another 2 or 3 decades. So it's a dual attack, both domestic and global. And you've got to understand that Trump is really about a new, more aggressive, virulent form of neoliberalism to restructure it where Obama could not for another several decades. That's what's going on. Well, I digressed a little bit. Let me get back, okay? All right, the top 1%. Let's go back to the top 1%. This is very fascinating, and it's data, by the way, that comes from the IRS. You see, there's a professor here at Berkeley in the early 2000s. His name is Manuel Saez. Some of you maybe heard of him. Who somehow he got hold of this IRS data, and he found out how much the 1% were really getting. How much were they really getting? The Commerce Department and the government obscured how much they were really getting. They wouldn't report the 1%. They only report 20%, the top 20%, you see. But what he found out was the top 1% between 1943 and 78 averaged only 8 to 10% share of the total income. 35 years of 8 to 10%. But then neoliberalism and Reagan comes in, and immediately it jumps to 15%. And by 2000, it was 21%. And it's remained at the 22, 23% level ever since, share of national income. Now keep in mind, a share of what that's growing exponentially. In 2000, national income was maybe about $1 trillion. 1980, $1 trillion. 2000, maybe 4 or 5. By 2008, 9, it was 9, 10. Today, it's 20. So it's a percentage share of a volume that's growing and growing. By the way, you can get all this information from his database as well. It's public. All right, who are the rest of us? Median income, annual income, all sources, probably about 55,000. Some little larger, little lower. Depends what you include or don't include in income. And of course, that's only been growing 8.7% a year, right? Less than 1% average growth per year income for the rest of us. And most of that is those who are in the 70, 80, 90 percentiles, not thus at median or below, right? And even so, the rest of the 99% of us, have only recovered 3/4 of the income we had in 2007. We haven't recovered yet, the rest of us, but the others have doubled or more. Let's talk about wages. Let's debunk that myth. All right, you all hear, and you read in the press, if you read, 3.1% wage increase last year, right? Who saw that? Yeah, 3.1%. Oh, well, it's part of the greatest economy ever, right? Okay. Well, that's not what their own data says. No, if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, the median worker, in other words, the worker, the middle class, working class worker making 50, 60,000 a year, right? The change per year over 28 years was 9.5% increase, 1/3 of 1% per year. Well, that's stagnant, By the way, this is all workers. This is a category called all workers. So it means professionals, it means supervisors, it means managers, it means all workers, even senior managers. And if you're below that, it's 1/4 of 1%, right? If you're in the top 5%, it's 1.8% per year, almost 2% per year. Okay. The real category for working class is hourly production and non-supervisory workers. This is about 120 million or so of the 160 million in the labor force. Their real wages, adjusted for inflation, has been negative since 1982. And what their wage will buy, in other words, it buys less today than it bought back then. The difference today, of course, is workers today are up to here on credit. They're spending everything on credit, not just their wage. And that's why the standard of living is rising, of course. But when you do it on credit, that means part of your future wage has to go for interest payments, which means your future wage is going to be even less over time as you continue, right? All right. And of course, all workers means bonuses and lump sum payments and other incentives and so forth of managers and supervisors. Okay, so here's a little more specific here. Real average hourly earnings for production and non-supervisory workers. Production non-supervisors. This is a subset of all workers, right? December 2016, it was $10.70 an hour according to Bureau of Labor Statistics. Last month, or September, $10.96. So on average, under Trump, you got 26 cents for the last 2.5 years, 26 cents an hour for the last 2.5. Now that's an average, right? And because it's an average, most of that is skewed to the very top, the higher paid, who maybe got 50 cents. But that means that those at the median got nothing, and those below got less than nothing. Okay? Average. Beware of averages. Okay. And yet Trump says 3.1% wage increase. Comes out to less than 1% on average. And depending where you are in your income level, it can be much less, right? Now, even at 3.1%, let's take that. That's wrong, because that's what's called nominal wage. It's not adjusted for inflation. And if you adjust it for the CPI, right, 1.7%, well, then your real wage, according to even Trump, the 3.1 becomes 1.4. But it's still an average, right? So it means those at the very top, tech workers and professionals in healthcare and so forth, got more than the 1.4%, when everyone else got less. But even that is misleading because they're only talking about full-time employed workers for that 3.1%. And we have 60 million people in this country now working part-time, temp, and gig work. 60 million of the 160 million in the labor force working gig work, and they're not included in that 3.1%, right? And it also includes those who are full-time for, whatever overtime pay they might have made, which comes and goes. Now, even the 1.7% is wrong, right? 1.7% inflation rate, because it's an average for the whole country. And if you're at the median, the inflation is higher for you because the mix of the basket of goods that you buy is more negative for inflation than the mix for someone who's making $200,000 a year, right? I'm not going to go into other technicalities, but you could argue that there's a problem with the 1.7 being underestimated, wages overestimated, inflation underestimated, because of chain pricing and other distortions, right? And it excludes certain college, health, and housing costs, right? Now, the important thing to remember is that if the higher the inflation, the lower the real wage. The lower the 3.1, or the actual 1, the higher the inflation. So if inflation is higher, which it actually is, wages are even lower than I've just described, real wages. In other words, their buying power. Well, do you really think that the price of things you bought in the last year only went up 1.4%? 1.7%? I mean, did any of you get a rent increase? Any of you had to pay more for a doctor's visit? Any of you see your premiums hiked and your deductibles and your co-pays on your insurance hiked? You're paying more for gasoline? I could go on and on. Average folks know that that's just nonsense, 1.7% inflation rate. Okay. apartments, rents, auto insurance, utility bills, property taxes, movies, doctor's visits, all of that, much higher. And the higher it is, the lower the real wages are. Now here's some independent surveys, from banks and other reputable sources here, right? More than 60% of Americans said they didn't get a pay raise at all last year or get a better paying job in the last year. That's from bankrate.com. That's a research group for banks. Market Watch. Real wages effectively declined in 2018, according to Pay Scale Index, a business salary comparison site. And Pay Scale, again, real wages have shrunk 0.8% over the last 12 months and 9% since 2006. In other words, alternative ways of looking at this, other than the government's, comes up with a different picture often, and you got to say, well, what's going on with the government statistics? Okay, let's go to unemployment. How accurate is the unemployment rate of 3.6%? Well, that's all you read in the paper, right? 3.6, right? Well, that only applies to full-time workers. That's what's called the U3 unemployment rate, full-time workers. And remember, we've got 60 million who aren't full-time, at least, right? And the way to define unemployment is not if you don't have a job. That has nothing to do with unemployment. That sounds pretty dumb, doesn't it? You don't have a job, but you're not unemployed. No, according to the U.S. government, that's not necessarily true. You got to be out of work, and you have to be looking for a job in the last 4 weeks to be considered unemployed, according to the way the U.S. defines it, and be part of the U3 estimate if you're a full-time worker, or you were, and you're looking for a full-time job, okay? If you haven't looked in 5 weeks or up to 52 weeks, you're part of what's called discouraged worker. And that's what's called the U4, U5 unemployment. We're adding a little bit to it, discouraged, right? Now, the strange thing about discouraged is the total amount of discouraged is not raised in 20 years. Even though the population in the labor force has grown by tens of millions, we still have the same absolute number of discouraged workers. Well, that makes it kind of suspicious, I would say. And if you haven't looked for a job, if you've totally dropped out, haven't looked for a job officially in the last year, you're part of the missing labor force. Now, the government, puts a plug in and says, well, we think this missing is so much, and we think discouraged is so much, and they add a little bit to the 3.6. And then they add underemployed, working part-time, to the 3.6, and they come up with about 7.4% unemployed. But they're grossly underestimating all of these categories, in my opinion. Another factor that supports the argument that the unemployed are really larger than you see, or they admit, is that the labor force participation rate is a number that suggests of those who are eligible to be in the labor force are actually looking for work and therefore in the labor force. Right? Participation rate. Well, that's dropped 4% in the last decade or so. Well, 4% of 160 million in the labor force is how many people? That's another 7 million, isn't it? 7 million, right? 7% unemployed is really about 10 million unemployed. Well, you add another 7 million because they don't know where these people went. I mean, they're hustling somewhere, They're paying for food somehow, somewhere in the underground economy, which they don't pick up. Why don't they pick it up? Because the way they get the unemployment number is they survey people by phone. 60,000 a month by phone. They survey them. Now, do you think that folks working in the underground economy are going to answer the phone from the Labor Department? Or if you're one of the 10 million undocumented, you're going to answer the phone for the Labor Department? There's at least 20 million people in the underground economy or undocumented who don't get picked up, and their unemployment rate tends to be higher. So that's another problem. And then 1 million more people have gone on disability since the Great Recession. I got to hand it to them. I don't think that's wrong. You know, if you can figure out a way to go on disability, you got guaranteed for life unemployment benefits, whereas on unemployment you get 6 months, and you get a lot more on disability. So some people are clever, you know. The working class can be pretty clever when it needs to, right? And figure out a way to game the system. Okay. So the real unemployment rate today is somewhere 10 to 12%, I think. You know, 16 to 20 million people. Okay, participation, I talk about EPOP is employee to population survey. We got a growth in the population, but we don't have a commensurate growth in the number employed. You know, which together with the participation rate issue kind of suggests, well, we're not picking up all these people who are jobless. The statistics, the data is not working all that well. 45% of all workers are working second and third jobs, 45%. 48% of millennials, 39% of Gen Xers, even 28% of boomers. Old folks going back into the labor force, getting part-time jobs because Social Security and their 401k just won't cover it anymore. Fastest growing part of the labor force, people over 65 going back in because they have to. Okay. Another thing is gig jobs. You know what a gig job is, right? Some of you probably got one, right? Anybody drive Uber here? Okay, well, you probably have a gig job, or you know somebody who does. Well, the government only counts gig workers for whom the Uber driving was their primary job. We know that most of the people who are doing gig work are doing it as second and third jobs. Okay. A lot of problems with the statistics and so forth in the government, and you got to really dig behind the scenes to see what those problems are. Okay, so we'll finish up now. Hopefully we debunked a little bit of inflation, unemployment, or employment, and wages, and GDP. And now let's just talk about, finish up on the question of the real economy. You know? Well, you hear a lot of talk, or they were getting a little bit worried, oh, are we in a recession? We're pretty close to recession, you know, but now they're saying, oh, well, the trade deal with China has been resolved, and we're not in a recession anymore. Well, and how about the rest of the world? Well, Europe's in a recession this quarter, certainly next quarter, if not this quarter. Germany already is. Right? Britain already is. Italy already is. So the Eurozone is slipping into recession, which will be its third recession, by the way, since 2008. Japan's even worse. They've had 4 recessions, in and out, in and out. No real growth at all, even worse there than in the US, which shows you this is a global problem of inability of capitalism to really generate again the economic growth that it did for 3 decades. There's a problem now. They're having a problem getting it all moving again. That's why Trump is doing some of this more aggressive stuff. We could talk about that. That's in the book. Right? But there's 2 areas of the U.S. economy. Remember I said GDP, 4 areas. What? Consumption, investment, business investment, right? Government spending, and exports over imports, or what we call net exports. Right? Those 4 areas will tell you whether you're in a recession or not. Fourth quarter, you know, it's going to be 1.7. From 3.1 in January quarter to 1.7. It's halved almost in 1 year, growth rate. And again, that growth rate is really less than what they're saying because of problems with GDP I'll talk about briefly here. GDP is too high. Well, in the third bullet here, GDP is too high because inflation is indicated too low, and because in 2013 they redefined GDP to give it a $500 billion boost. They went backwards and forwards with that $500 billion boost. What did they do? Well, they added categories like logos. What's the value of your company logo? And, you know, what's the value of your intellectual property? Or, you know, you wrote a song, but you didn't sell it yet. Well, what do you think the value of that is? And so forth. These very ephemeral things, or R&D, which used to be an expense. Oh, now it's part of GDP, right? Other countries are even worse than we are. I mean, what is Britain and Europe doing? They're adding to GDP the value of the drug smuggling and their brothels. Yeah, I mean, can you imagine? Here's a government bureaucrat near his cat house, right? He's standing outside, and as the Johns come out, he says, "Well, how much did you pay? How much did you get, and how much did you pay?" Well, of course, they're not doing that, and the drug smugglers aren't telling them what they're selling coke on the street for, right? So the bureaucrats make up a number. It's totally fictitious. They make up a number. Or in India, overnight, they doubled their GDP because they redefined it. Yeah, overnight. GDP numbers are not reliable. And GDP, you think GDP, 2 consecutive quarters of GDP means you got a recession. No, that's not the definition of a recession. A recession is whatever the 50 or so most prominent U.S. economists who belong to the National Bureau of Economic Research say it is after the fact. And they look at GDP, they look at industrial production, they look at employment, look at retail sales, they look at trade, they look at everything, and then they come to a kind of a consensus. Okay, we had a recession. Well, in 2001, we had a recession that was only 1 quarter. It wasn't 2 quarters. So GDP is not the best indicator for a lot of reasons. I just mentioned one that really irks me, and that is, did you know they count as income in GDP the amount of rent that homeowners pay to themselves? Let that sink in, right? Homeowners pay themselves a rent? I could use the money, give it from my right hand to my left hand, but I don't do that. Well, there's a lot of funny things going on with government statistics, right? But if you look at the business investment, it's contracted the last 2 quarters, and it's going to contract again in the 4th. It turns negative. And business investment is a real driver to GDP in the economy. And also trade. Trade is negative. We've had 18 months of the trade war. The trade deficit is higher today than it was in March 2018 when Trump started the trade war. It's worse than it ever was. This is a phony trade war, except for the Chinese, U.S. versus China. And in the U.S. versus China, it's really about a tech war. We can talk about that a little bit if you want when we get to that, right? We're in a manufacturing recession. That's been contracting. Construction is contracting in the U.S., except a little bit recovery now in residential housing, but apartments and commercial properties. The global economies are contracting, a lot of key global economies. We have a trade war. Volume of trade has contracted for the first time ever. Okay. I think maybe I'll skip this one because this talks a little bit about 3 kinds of recessions that I've been talking about. Economists, professional economists say all recessions are the same, right? And Paul Krugman, who he is, right? He coined the term Great Recession for 2008-9, and I wrote an article and I said, well, what does great mean, Paul? Does it mean worse than normal and not as bad as the 1930s? That don't tell me much. What do you mean by great? Of course, he didn't reply to me. And then there's normal recessions, Great Depressions, and they're all different, okay? Okay, slowdown, global slowdown, I've talked about this everywhere. World trade volume is negative. We're in a global manufacturing recession, manufacturing contracting everywhere around the world virtually. Europe and Germany are entering recession. Latin American economies are going south real quick. That's why we got all the discontent going on in Latin America, right now. Right? And of course, all the neoliberal policies down there with Macri in Argentina, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Pinero in Chile, right? They're only making things worse. Because they're not there to recover their economy. They're there, now that they're in power, real quick, to give their buddies a bigger share of the pie. That's what it's all about. China is slowing. India is about half of what it says it is. And then all these emerging markets with commodity producers are in recession as well. And then finally, final slide here, investment contracted, as I said, manufacturing contracting, trade is more imports than exports were negative. That's a negative off of GDP. Construction, consumption. We hear about the consumers holding everything up and doing so well. Well, Chase Bank has estimated that the Trump tariffs starting in September are going to cost each household on average $1,000 in spending. $1,000. That's Chase Bank, right? In other words, don't hold your hopes too high about the consumer keeping this economy going. Autos are in free fall, and retail sales now are beginning to show some weakness. Student debt, 1.6 trillion, auto debt, 1.1 trillion, credit card debt, 1 trillion, mortgage debt, 7 trillion. We're up to here in debt, right? And the more debt you have, the more interest you got to pay, and the less you can spend on everything else. So the more credit rises, in early stage, yeah, you spend more, but then it starts cutting into your spending. Corporate debt, $10 trillion in non-financial corporate debt. U.S. government debt, 22 trillion, going to 34 trillion by the end of 2028, which the Congressional Budget Research Office says will cost us by 2028 $900 billion a year just in interest alone. Okay, well, that's the review of the economy. And the question is, though, what is it that got us here? Can we fill in the gaps between the result and what's happened over the last 4 decades? And now it's happening in a more intensified way, even. Right? So I guess we just open questions.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. My question was related to this news we hear about the trade war with China. And I was just wondering if you could enlighten us on kind of what are the key sticking points that are really going on underneath the, what you may hear from the news or Trump. Like, what is kind of driving that, and what are the implications of that in the future? Or are we heading towards, like, for example, a situation where we could have a war with China in the next couple of decades? Do you see that as being a valid or viable thing?
Well, that's one of my favorite questions. I dedicated 20-some pages to that in the chapter on Trump in the book. Look, you got to understand, Trump's trade war is a phony war with everybody except China. With China, it's real. The beginning of the trade war with China occurred as soon as Trump got into office. He then assigned his trade representative, United States Trade Representative Office. It's like a quasi-cabinet position. Robert Lighthizer. He assigned him to come up with a report as to how much of an economic threat is China. And Lighthizer issued his report in August of 2017, and in that report, he identified that China and its policy called China 2025 was a real threat to the United States in 3 areas that involved technology. That China was attempting by 2025 to leapfrog the U.S. in next-generation technology. That included artificial intelligence, 5G wireless, and cybersecurity, which were not only the technologies of the next decade in terms of industries, right, and the economy, they are the key technologies for military dominance. So the U.S. saw that as a threat. 6 months later, in March 2018, Lighthizer issues his report and says, well, guess what? Yeah, the Chinese are a big problem in these 3 areas of technology. A week later, Trump launches his trade war. 1 week later. They were waiting for this. And he launches it on steel and aluminum tariffs everywhere to make it look like, it wasn't just China. But he really intensely went after China immediately, slapped 50 billion of tariffs on China. He didn't do that to the rest of these countries. I mean, like South Korea is one of the top 2 or 3 steel importers to the U.S., right? Trump announced his tariffs on steel and aluminum, Canada's aluminum, and immediately gave exemptions to everybody, thousands of exemptions, okay? I need double time for this one. Anyway, I'm giving a background because this is very important to understand where we are today. And so we got this trade war with China, which escalates. 2 times there was a deal almost made with China, and 2 times the neocons who run the trade policy, Lighthizer, Peter Navarro, right? These are anti-China guys, neocons, and then John Bolton got in there while he was still around, right? They've been driving the policy on China. And there was almost an agreement in May 2018. The other member of the U.S. on the negotiating team is Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, who represents the big banks. And the big banks got really what they wanted early from China, which was a majority ownership of banking activity in China. China conceded that to them. And China also said, we will buy, over the next 5 years, $1 trillion of imports or exports from the U.S., farm products and so forth. So big business got what they wanted, but the Pentagon and the, those interests, the military-industrial complex and so forth, did not want to deal with China because of the technology and the military implications of that technology issue. So they've gone round and round. They almost had a deal again in this past May, but that blew up. And each time, the neocons blew it up. The last time the neocons blew it up because before China was coming over and they inserted a couple new demands even before China got here. And, excuse me, one of those demands was China had to share its development in those new technologies with the United States. They actually had to share it with the United States. Well, that's, no one's going to agree to that, right? So it blew up. The Chinese came over, said, hi, Donald, and left. And then Trump meets again with President Xi in June at the G20 meeting in Osaka, Japan, and they agree you won't impose any more tariffs, Donald, because he's been adding tariffs time and time again throughout this whole thing. But then he goes back and Trump raises tariffs on him in August, and the Chinese started letting their currency devalue. Because if you devalue a currency, you offset the tariffs. And that caused the stock market to crash. We had a big crisis, a mini crisis in August, okay? And I've just doubled the time, so I'm just going to have to finish up on this and tell you to read the book. Basically, as you get closer to the election, Trump wants some kind of deal, so he called the Chinese back, and they struck this mini deal where he said, well, I got the Chinese to give me 51% and buy more farm goods. Well, they had offered that a year before, but not in the deal was anything about technology. So the Chinese won. They got that off the table, you see. But now there's maneuvering going on because the Chinese now want the tariffs off, but Trump may not let the tariffs off, but Trump needs some kind of a settlement for his political Midwest base and farm base. So he's going to take, I predict in the book, he's going to take the money and run. In fact, I wrote an article on that. Take the money and run, and then after the elections, come back and fight the technology war, because the technology is the big issue underneath the trade issue. The trade issue is a cover, that's all.
Yeah, I wanted to know how Social Security fits into all of this.
How it fits into all this? Oh, okay. They're nibbling at Social Security and Medicare because it's too big they call it the third rail, American politics. You can nibble at it, chip away at it, and people won't realize what's happening. But if you go after it big time, you're going to mobilize people to resist. So they're chipping at it. They talked about under Bush and even Obama in 2013 going after it, right? It's called the fiscal cliff. And they haven't left that. They're going to, in the meantime, chip away, but they're going to go after it. They have to go after it because they're not going to cut their defense spending, which is now rising $100 billion a year. They're not going to cut or raise taxes that they cut on their wealthy folks, and that's true with the Democratic wing of the corporate party of America. They're all in agreement on that. But they're going, their deficits are going, as I said here, from 22 trillion to 34 trillion. And if you don't go after taxes and you don't go after defense, the only big chunk you can go after are the entitlements. somehow, sometime, there's going to be a war over the entitlements in this country, probably in the next decade.
One thing that that has happened with world capitalism was the Great Depression, obviously, and the Second World War. And the Second World War practically helped, unfortunately, the world to get out of, the economic depression. So what has happened after that is that we have more common and more frequent than any time in history, so-called recessions. Right now, we're in a period that, for example, I downloaded a report from the World Bank and another from the IMF, where they themselves admit that in the next couple of years, the standard of living in the advanced industrialized countries is going to come down, and it will be more accurate in the third world. And one of the things that is a dictatorship in the capitalist system is the financial domination. I download a report from the International Monetary Fund about the Republic of Chile, and they themselves say openly that more than 60% of Chile's GDP will go into payments for foreign debt. I mean, and their debt is around 189 billion, approximately, which is even higher than the debt that the colony of Puerto Rico has, a so-called sovereign country. My observation and question is, I have seen economic indicators that say that some sectors of international manufacturing that the U.S. used to lead, now they are like in fourth, fifth, third place, like in the auto production. Like now Toyota and Volkswagen lead the pack. Also among international banking, the Chinese banks are on the top. And in the first 10, there are only 2 American banks, as something different than 25 years ago. And the total GDP between China, the European Union, and the United States, particularly China and the United States, is very close. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, the Chinese total GDP is higher. So it seems to be that the American capitalist is kind of a big competition toward its rivals internationally. And although it's the main and most powerful capitalist class, is more or less internationally because the capitalist system is also a competitive system. Yes. So don't you think that these worldwide corporate competitions have weakened U.S. hegemony somewhat, has a fierce competition? And also, could you please comment on the ingrained systematic crisis of capitalism itself? That's my humble question. And thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay. Well, that's an important but very broad question. Let's just to comment on the IMF. The IMF is raising warnings and demanding or asking the major countries that contribute to the IMF, which is really controlled by the U.S., right? The IMF was set up by the U.S. in the second restructuring in 1944, as was the World Bank, and they were supposed to have a WTO trade organization, but the U.S. scuttled that. The IMF, the important thing to remember is it's got $250 billion to bail out other countries' currencies. That's what the IMF does. When a country has a crisis, it can't pay its bills to the big banks, usually from US and Europe. It borrows money and it can't pay, right? The IMF will give them money to pay the big banks. In fact, the IMF doesn't give the money to the country. It gives them on the name of the country to the bank. You see, it goes from the IMF in Washington to Chase Manhattan or whatever in New York. But the third world country, an emerging market country, has to pay for it. Let's take the case of Argentina right now, right? The IMF gave them a $56 billion loan, right, to pay off the hedge funds from the U.S. from the last crisis because they were insisting being paid off, and they wouldn't take part of the deal in the settlement. They wanted all of it. Paul Singer and Elliott Management leading that whole group. And when Macri comes in, business guy in Argentina, first thing he does, he gets a loan from the IMF and he pays off the vulture guys. First thing, right? And then he goes to New York, and U.S. bankers said, now you can borrow $50 billion more on top of the IMF. So now they're $100 billion in debt, right? And they've messed up that whole economy. They have no intention of solving the economic problems of this country. It's just like a deal to rip it off, with the IMF and the big Western banks. Now, it's true, that we got global finance capital growing in Asia and different places in the world, right? But don't underestimate the power of American finance capital. They are still dominant, still, right? European banks are in more trouble than the U.S. European is the sick boy of the world banking system. So there's competition. It's increasing, and that's why you got to understand what Trump is doing. You see, he's trying to restructure these power relationships, not just in trade, but in money flows, to put neoliberalism back on its feet so the U.S. can continue to dominate for another several decades. But he's having trouble doing that. And he's aggravating, the Europeans. He's aggravating, different places, and it's not working so far. My forecast is he's going to fail. And the capitalists are competing with each other. I wrote a couple of articles about finance capital in Argentina and finance capital in Venezuela. And you got to understand that it's a finance capitalist world now. That's dominant. And the U.S. empire is manipulated and administered primarily through financial means. The U.S., unlike the British, has come up with a form of imperialism in which it lets the indigenous capitalists have a big taste of the profits. And it bails them out when there's insurrections and so forth, right? But they benefit as well from the whole thing. And that's how the U.S. keeps it going. And by manipulating IMF and the World Bank and the banking system and the SWIFT international payment system, which is key to the U.S. being able to find out who's violating the sanctions, right? And the Chinese and even the Europeans and Iranians are trying to set up an alternative payment system. If they do, and there's an alternative currency to the dollar, then that's the beginning of the end of the U.S. financial global hegemony. But they're not there yet. They're not even close.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. Actually, I have a question which is kind of a follow-up to Comrade Ricardo's question. You talked about a possibility of a global recession, right, with Germany going down, Japan going down, the UK going down. But one thing is, how are these all tied together? Like, what are the mechanisms that tie the US to India, to China, to the UK, to Germany, to all these economies? So that's my first question. My second question is totally unrelated in a way. So you talked about these big data issues, which are really important. But I'm also wondering what was going on. What did you observe in the labor process itself? What was going on the shop floor level? If you could respond to those, that'd be great. Thank you.
Well, I've been away from the shop floor for decades, but I got a lot of friends and I keep in touch with them and so forth. The globalization, which required the global financialization. You see, the money had to flow before the factories moved offshore. I mean, they call it supply chains now, right? That's why they had to deregulate global financial flows and financialize the global economy to enable free trade treaties. You think it's about goods and tariffs crossing borders, right? Just go read the NAFTA document. NAFTA is mostly about the terms and conditions of which U.S. corporations are going to be allowed to invest in Mexico, right? The money flows. which they don't talk about, are more important than the goods flows. They come before the goods flows, you see. And then once they make the goods in Mexico, it's about U.S. corporations. How can they get that stuff back without paying tariffs, you see? So it's really cutting tariffs on U.S. corporations. In fact, 49% of all the imports to the U.S. from China involve U.S. corporations and their partners in China. But you don't hear Trump saying, well, let's put a 50% tariff, on General Motors, right? No, it's, let's do it on the Chinese, as if the Chinese are even paying the tariffs. We're paying the tariffs, not China. So, you got to understand it's the connection, the glue is money. The glue between all these countries is money, and it's the financial system, the banking system, the shadow banking system. These people are international, right? They've set up these financial markets around the world, and I don't mean just stock markets, but all kind of derivative markets, and they move the money around instantaneously now because of technology, right? The money flows back and forth, and the essence of American imperialism is it's locked in the indigenous capitalists. It's given them a big part of the pie to get their cooperation. There's something called the twin deficits, you see. We've been running a trade deficit since 1980 on purpose. Trade deficit means more dollars flow out of the U.S. because we buy more of their goods than they buy of ours. So net, more dollars flow out of the U.S. and they accumulate offshore. Right? We run a trade deficit on purpose because we have an agreement with the indigenous capitalists in these countries for them to recycle those dollars back to the U.S. by buying treasury bonds, treasury bills, and even investing in companies. That hundreds of billions come back every year from the trade deficit into the U.S. Treasury, which allows the U.S. Treasury to run a budget deficit by cutting taxes and raising defense spending. Those two deficits work together. You see, one creates the condition for the other. If they didn't have the trade deficit, they couldn't cut taxes and raise defense spending as much as they do. They would have to really go after Social Security then. So we are attached at the hip with all these other capitalist economies around the world. And that's what the connections. It's a financial connection as well as a goods flow connection.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is, could you talk about the effect on a whole generation of young people who owe student debt and how that affects the economy? I mean, they're not buying cars, they're not buying houses, they're not getting married. There's all sorts of economic effects that the student debt has. And I'd like a little commentary on that. And my second question is, I understand that if we paid reparations to African Americans, the money would end up in the hands of Wells Fargo and Bank of America because they would be buying houses and cars and all the rest of it. Could you talk about that too? Thank you.
Well, I know firsthand student debt. I got a son who is a classic example, poor guy, student debt. He went to graduate school, so he's really loaded up on student debt, It's a form of new indentureship. It is. It's a form of indentureship. Look, it's a crime. You know what they charge? The education office charges students for student debt, 6.8%. Unless you want to go turn it over to a private, consolidate it with a private lender. I think they charge 6.8% to force everybody to go into the banks and to borrow from the banks so the banks can actually then again get their claws into student loans, because under Obama they were sort of kicked out a little bit, but 6.8%, If I'm a bank, a prime bank, I can borrow at 1.5% if I'm from a bank. And we charge our students 6.8%. Well, I won't tell you how much he owes, but he's paying $800 a month. And only $50 a month is going to principal. Yeah, because he deferred it. all these years. He deferred it when he was in graduate school. So the interest accumulates, and they make you pay the interest first before they start paying off. It's a crime. It's an absolute crime what they're doing. $1.6 trillion in student debt. You know, they will never get out of it somehow. I mean, certainly not if you've got a liberal arts education and you're not working down there for Google. You know, you're never going to get out of that hole. Well, it affects his life because, I mean, you can't start a family, you know, when you're that much in debt. You can't buy a house, you know. You're driving a junky old car that you try to keep together with, you know, chewing gum and wire, right? And the millennials have been condemned for decades of near poverty, decades. And they're the ones who are stuck, most of them, you know, with a lot of these part-time service gig jobs and working longer hours than ever before. Longer hours, you know. It's a myth that, oh, you know, we're in the modern times, we don't work as hard or as long. We're working longer hours than ever before, especially if you got 2 or 3 jobs, you know. I won't tell you what I'd do if I were a millennial and stuck with that much student debt. You know, we wouldn't put up with that in the 70s. You know, no way. We've been camped out on the White House lawn. Yeah.
Yeah. You were very much like talking about the Defense Department. I'm wondering, besides, you know, what do you call it, addressing American power overseas, is there other roles that all this defense spending has in the American capitalist economy? Why do we have to have such a big?
Because we have to have it because they got the big lobbyists. That's why we got to have it, you know.
But, okay, so it's just the lobbyists. I mean, is it, you know,
well,
is there some benefit to them from spending money on defense rather than on roads and bridges, for instance?
well, you know, they got much more political pull, the defense companies, than do your local construction company, that's for sure. You know, in World War II, we were able to build 50,000 aircraft for $50,000 each, you know, and now we pay, what, $200 million for one airplane, you know? And most of that is not made in, well, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of it's not made in the U.S., you know. In order to get the sales to the Japanese and the Germans and so forth, you know, we let them build a wing and the other guys build a tail and so forth. And the defense technology does not generate the jobs it used to generate, you know. So it's taking more and more of the wealth of the country, and then it just blows it up or throws it in the ocean or parks it in the desert, right? But it's not generating as many jobs. So it's not as important as far as employment for the rest of us. But, you know, they're making super profits off of it, those companies and, you know, their shareholders.
Yeah, so I'm curious, like, given everything you laid out about the inequalities, but also given, like, the massive social movements we're seeing around the world, do you have a sense that there's more of an appetite, you know, amongst the financial class on Wall Street to make serious reforms? Or is it just steady business?
Well, it's interesting. You know, I read international business press religiously, you know, several newspapers a day, and you see more and more of these editorials about, oh, we got to reform capitalism. Oh, we better watch out. You know, those who are more prescient, you know, they say, oh, we better watch out. This inequality is going to come back and bite us. We got to do something about it, you know. So you see more of that being talked about because they know, you know, there's eruptions going on. You know, there's the Yellow Vest. There was Occupy. There's what's going on in Latin America now and different places around the world. And I think a lot of that discontent is really young people who are just desperate and don't see much hope or future, and they don't want to take it anymore, you know? Because this thing I described of the job market, the labor market, you know, financial markets have been radicalized for the capitalists, but the labor markets have been radicalized too. You know, all these part-time, temp, gig work and so forth, and we haven't seen the worst of it yet. Wait till artificial intelligence really begins to hit next decade. The McKinsey consultants put out a report last year or so, and they predicted that 30% of the occupations would go away. 30% of the occupations. Artificial intelligence will eliminate simple decision-making in services and everywhere else. So folks that are cobbling together second and third jobs, 2 or 3 of these jobs, millennials and young folks, so, those jobs are going to go away. What are we going to do? Or what are they going to do is the question. So we haven't seen the worst of the crisis in the labor market yet, I think. I think it's going to be even worse. And they know it. They know what's coming. They know, they can see the eruptions occurring, and they know what's coming. The more observant of them are saying, we better do something, but they're not doing anything. And they're not going to do anything either. They're going to think that they can hold out whenever there are these demonstrations. They can hold out like with Occupy. They can hold out like the Yellow Vests, right? They can hold out like in Hong Kong, right? And they're going to do that. They're going to try that. But the problem I see is, and I talk about and bring people on my radio show all the time, the problem is the only question today is a question of organization. What kind of organization is going to lead to resistance? And what we see in this kind of anarchist, no leader kind of a thing, it doesn't work. You have to get organized, and you have to contend for the institutions of power if you want to stop this and prevail. And that's going to take a new kind of political party, I think, from the bottom up.
Well, we have a left one at that.
Okay, so did I see your hand in the back a little while ago?
Well, it's funny that you ended on that, because that was pretty much what I was gonna lead up to, was like, where's the hope in any of it, and how do you really organize? I mean, what I've tried to get involved, like locally in my community, around things that are affecting us directly, because think globally, act locally is what I was thinking about. But the organizing, I'm just like, well, then how do we do this? It's just there's so much to contend with. And the organizing of folks is really difficult, I mean, it's to get, like, we go door to door sometimes, and you're talking to people, and that's how you really make some of the best connections is actually, people. And it just seems like a huge feat, so, yeah.
Well, they will find a way. I'm really convinced of that. They will find a way. Look, working folks aren't stupid. They will try every easy way out first before they come to the conclusion, I got to get up my ass, I got to do something, right? And we're in a period, I think, where you have a lot of social movements that are beginning to grow. But what's going to happen is that leaders of these social movements are going to have to come together and no longer lead single issues and no longer get trapped in identity politics. And the leaders of these movements will have to come to the conclusion, I can't any longer be a big frog in a small pond. I got to join with other frogs, and we have to all get together. And when enough of those leaders, real leaders from the bottom up, I don't believe in intellectuals saying, let's form a party. Right? When real leaders or real movements get together and say, let's have a convention in California or national or whatever, bona fide leaders are real movements, and they come together, that's how a new party will be born. And I think we're at the early stage of that. The conditions are beginning to develop locally, but it's a long way. It's a long way and a hard road, but the reality will force people, I believe, in that direction.
So,
this fellow's got a long list here.
No. It's very short, hopefully. You mentioned the corporate debt at 10 trillion, and I was reading about how before the 2008 it was around 5 or 6 trillion, and that now it's so high that you're starting to see credit default swaps and these sorts of things on the corporate debt, insurance, banking, investing, that the corporations won't be able to pay it back, blah, blah, blah. I'm just wondering if you can comment on that. Why is the corporate debt so high? Does it mean anything? And how much was these low, long-term, post-2008 recession, low interest rates that were supposed to get the economy going again, if so much of it went into the if so much of it went into the financial sector, doesn't that mean there's something to be said about the fact that this money can't be invested for some reason in new production, new manufacturing, because those markets are already sort of oversaturated or something like this? I'm just wondering if you can comment on what's the real reason the capitalist system can't kind of get out of its this 2008 crisis without just going into greater and greater debt.
Okay. I held this book up. This is my book of last year. Central Bankers at the End of Their Ropes, right? Monetary Policy in the Coming Depression, right? What happened in the 2008 crash? Interest rates were, the benchmark interest rate was 5.25%. And then immediately the central bank, the Federal Reserve, dropped it to 0.1%, okay? Which means money was free. In other words, bankers, because only bankers can borrow from the Fed, right? Bankers, come on in, we'll give you all the money you want. Here, we're going to throw the money at you. And we hope we throw enough at you that a little bit will maybe trickle down into the real economy. But it's going to be free money. And we threw $5 to $6 trillion of free money at businesses and banks. 5 to 3 trillion. And the debt was added to the Federal Reserve debt of $4.5 to $5 trillion. They got debt. Government, 22 trillion. They got $4.5 trillion. And globally, all the banks did the same thing because all the capitalist banks worked together. And $20 trillion at minimum of free money was thrown at the banking system. Where did that money go? It didn't go into the real economy because we got the sluggish growth, right? Where did the money go? Well, as I talk about it, the money either went offshore to emerging markets after 2008, which boomed for a couple of years, or it went into financial asset markets, stocks and bonds, which boomed and made even more money, or it went into mergers and acquisitions, which didn't create any jobs, in fact, destroyed jobs, right? Or it's sitting on balance sheets out there. Look, there's tens of trillions of dollars sitting on the sidelines right now. Tens of trillions in the U.S. alone. Investors, people who have the money. They just don't want to invest it in creating real things that hire real people. Yeah, there's some of that going on. I'd say it's not all, but there's some of that going on. They want to invest it in financial markets because it's so much more profitable for them. And that's what financialization is all about. Capitalism in the 21st century has figured out a way to enrich itself, not from making goods, but from making money from money. Making money from money, not making money by making things anymore. That's a fundamental change in it. But when you do that, you build up all this debt. And the areas of the corporate debt to watch are junk bonds, BBB grade, investment grade bonds, leverage loans, and other junk. In other words, companies who borrowed so much that once a recession occurs and the prices stop falling, they can't pay the interest and the principal on that debt. They will go bankrupt. Then you are back in 2008 when that happens. When will that happen? It's hard to say.
Okay, in the red, over
So-
here.
So to hear Trump describe conditions, we hear unemployment at all-time lows, markets at all-time highs. He describes a rosy picture. His adjective he would probably use is perfect. So can you point out, as you have sort of, what are sort of the elements of the smoke and mirrors? How does the administration get away with this, covering for this dissonance? Of course, we know the middle class has been hollowed out, and anyone but the top 1, 10, or 25%, take your number, are really struggling and challenged. What can you kind of speak to that dissonance in addition to what you've already commented?
Well, it's because the corporate media all sings the same tune. Trump says, "Oh, fake news, fake news." His buddies at Fox, and that's fake news. That's fake news, right? But they're not much better at CNN and New York Times and so forth. It's all, to some degree, manipulated reality. And average people go along with it because they're struggling just to keep their head above water, right? And at the same time, where are they going to turn? Where are they going to turn? I mean, a big majority of people want a union now. 70, 80% want a union. But they've hobbled, the Gulliver. They tied down the Gulliver Union so much with legal and so forth, he hardly can move anymore. They decimated the unions. And I know, because I've seen it, the whole transformation from the time that, as I said earlier, when unions were a force to today when they're, except for the public workers and the teachers, because they can't send their jobs offshore, right? All the rest are scared. Right? But where are they going to turn? Do you want the average worker to put on a yellow vest and go out there and demonstrate? No, he's not going to do that. That's why I say the question of the day is the organization question, whether it's economic organization or political organization. And until folks see a real alternative, they're not going to throw themselves against the wall. And you can't blame them for that either.
Over here with the black hat.
Thank you for that presentation. Just in response to what other people were asking, that's exactly what this organization or this group exists for. Our goal is to really explore what a different world would look like and to involve people in daily organizing activities to build a type of organization where we can start to...
Running the show the way he used to run his business. The United States of America is his business right now. And that's why the traditional capitalist country are having heartburn with him. He's not playing by the old rules. He's got these new rules. As to when another crisis, clearly what precipitated that crisis is the banks and the finance markets got overextended and the prices got out of whack. And then you had a collapse in the derivatives market. Subprime mortgage and derivatives market brought down regular banks, threatened to bring down the commercial banks, traditional banks, and then that brought down the rest of the economy. I don't think the next one's going to be like that. I think the next one has got to have something to do with the fact that non-financial corporations up to their ears in debt that they won't be able to pay the principal and interest on, and they will default. And when they default, then the holders of that debt default as well. And then we're on something similar. Last time it went from finance to the real economy. This time I think it's going to go from the real economy to the financial economy. And then, of course, everything feeds back on each other, and both of them go down. Right? So watch the banks in Europe. They're in trouble. Watch some of the emerging markets, like in Latin America. That's a source. Watch the dollarized debt, in the emerging market countries. There's a lot of sources. Non-performing bank loans, 10 trillion non-performing bank loans. In other words, whoever the bank loaned to, they're not paying back the banks, In India, watch the shadow banks in India. It's a very shaky situation over there. It could happen anywhere, and it comes out of the blue. You won't see it. You'll be surprised where it comes from.
Okay, so first let me say we still have the question of reparations open, as well as, I believe, the low interest rates post-recession. Okay. So back here with the red flannel.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I think one of the things that struck me when you talked about the atomization of the working class today in this country, which is a huge, huge change as well. And I think part of what we hear from a talk like this is it could be not only enlightening, but fairly discouraging, especially if we put the question of the drastic climate change behind it. So when we're looking at each one of us individually, therein begins the solution. because mass movements by themselves have never, and I don't think we will see it this time because we're not going to have the time, have never been able to totally transform the society. There has to be, unless there is sort of a history of struggle, and that's one of the things that we've lost in this country. So you started out with the 70s talking about that, which is sort of the end and the coal miner strikes and so on, and then we see what's happened to the working class. So each individual in this room can be a bearer of some of that history as we move into struggles. Because the tradition in this country that we have is to look for those leaders, organic or whatever, they'll lead us and so on and so forth. But the question is, where are we being led? And if we don't understand the nature of the beast that you've described fairly well, we can find ourselves up in, into another one of their dungeons or dead ends. So I think, the question of organization, I agree totally, is on the agenda. I have one question that relates to Hong Kong, is the significance of the banks in Hong Kong, because this is not a great productive economy. It's basically what you're talking about. The significance of the banks, or the role of those banks to the Chinese economy, the economy of the mainland, of the People's Republic of China. And if that's, I won't even go further than that.
Well, the Hong Kong banks are important to China, but not as important as they used to be. China moved a lot of its business to Shanghai, its banking business to Shanghai, so it wouldn't be totally reliant on Hong Kong. Plus, it encouraged the development of a shadow banking system, which it's been sort of struggling to keep under control. So China is not as dependent on Hong Kong as it used to be. Hong Kong's more of an independent, I would say probably Singapore is even more important than Hong Kong, maybe. Maybe that has something to do with what's going on there. It's hard to see behind the scene what's happening in Hong Kong, but I think there's a lot of discontent for real living condition reasons for young people in Hong Kong. I think that's fueling it. You don't get those kind of demonstrations ongoing the way they have been simply because of some extradition law. It's more than that, But we don't get a very clear picture, I think, on purpose. I think the media obfuscates what's actually going on there in Hong Kong. But there's also a little bit of an element of, Occupy Yellow Vests. What we should see in that and the demonstrations elsewhere going around the world is that just spontaneous, and I agree with you, mass demonstrations will dissipate eventually unless there is some organization and some leadership. And I'm very much an advocate that you have to contest for the institutions of power, political power, electorally and other ways, if you want to make change. That's a great source of power, and you look at revolutions that have been successful, whether right or left, they've prevailed, or somehow they've been able to assume those institutions of power, sometimes peacefully and sometimes not, but peacefully, yes. So I think somehow we have to come to the realization that we need a movement that will produce a political party that contests what I call the two wings of the corporate party of America, Democrats and Republicans.
Okay, Blue up here.
Is there any good news? Is there any good news?
Is there any good news? Yeah, look, I tell you what's the good news. I've been in the last couple of years speaking to various groups, and they kind of look like me, but I see a lot of young faces up there. That's the good news. Because you're going to have to save us from climate change, because I don't think capitalism is going to be able to resolve the climate crisis. I think it's going to wait too long, and then it's going to use the crisis as a tool against everybody else to create a more authoritarian regime. But I don't think they will do it. And that's its big weakness. The two big weaknesses I see looking out, decades in the future. One is the climate change problem for capitalism. I don't think they'll resolve it. And the other is what I was describing earlier, and that is they are driven so hard and so fast into technology that they're destroying jobs, destroying standards of living, destroying incomes, and creating a massive population of second-class economic citizens, a massive population. And I don't think people are going to put up with that. And they talk about, guaranteed income and so forth, maybe we'll have to do that, or helicopter money or whatever, but they're not going to do that either, They're going to wait to see how far they can tolerate it. It's like bargaining. I've been in scores of union negotiations, as a contract negotiator, and I'll tell you, sometimes I've been in positions where I didn't have a lot of strength behind me, and management and their capitalists is the same thing. They will keep pushing you, backing you up, testing you, see how far you're willing to back up, and if you keep backing up, they'll keep pushing you, until you are against the wall. And you either disappear or, you push back. The General Motors workers pushed back a little bit, right? But then, the management GM was clever enough, threw them a big pot of money up front and bought their vote, but they still got this big problem of temporary workers in the auto factories making $12 an hour to start. Can you imagine working in an auto factory for $12 an hour, right? So they will push you, and politically, climate change, the analogy is they will allow it to happen, and wait until they see a reaction that they think they got to maybe try to buy off at first, placate at first, but not really resolve. And I think the problem with the climate thing is once it gets going, you can't just turn it around by throwing money at it, you see. So that's a big weakness, I think it has. And the other big weakness is the radical changes they're making in the labor market and creating millions and millions of second-class citizens who will have no work of any kind, of any meaningful income to survive as a normal human being. And that's coming within, both of those things are coming within the next 20 years of your lifetime, those of you who are younger.
So we only have time for about one question, so we're going to have to leave some questions on the table, I'm sorry, but we will have a little bit of time afterwards to have a more informal discussion. Over here with the purple, last question.
I already have my question.
It's not really a question, it's just a comment. You're talking about the good news, a little bit of good news, and the fact that there are some young faces here. I've been teaching for a long time, I guess now it's 26 years, and when we talk about capitalism being messed up today and the way the whole society is structured, it doesn't fall on deaf ears now. I mean, it reverberates in a way today that I found that in my past history, it never did. And it's been incremental, I felt it over time. The crisis, Occupy, we know there's been a consciousness shift. And today, absolutely, I feel it. And I feel like it's really an opportunity now for us to talk as much as we can to young people about the history that we know about social movements, about the possibility of building a different kind of society, a society where working people actually controlled the product of the labor that we create on this earth, and that we save the planet for human species, but all the other species that we're dependent on. Young people, a lot of young people understand that it's now or never with that. And it's both very frightening, which can be paralyzing, but there comes that moment, potentially, when all that fear gets lost. I love the slogan of the Chilean youth movement today. They say it's not 30 cents, the price increase in the subway, that led them to, into this social movement. It's not 30 cents, it's the last 30 years, but also we've lost our fear. And clearly here today, the young people that I know haven't lost their fear. They're still kind of like, I gotta work really hard so that I can get this degree and get that degree and, maybe be a good worker, but maybe get a good job. And, everybody's afraid and feeling under the gun right now, but that can't last forever. And with luck, it'll happen before the planet isn't inhabitable. And, but we've got a lot of organizing to do before that moment happens, so that when it does happen, we can actually lead something toward a reorganization society and not just a social movement that pitters out as you suggested.
Let me just make one more comment along those lines. About 15 years ago, I was asked by the Longshore Workers Union to write a play for them based on their history. And it was produced in San Francisco called Fire on Pier 32. And that led me into really looking into their archives and their histories, their oral histories of the people that were involved in the birth of that union in 1934, the general strike in San Francisco. And the realization I came to from investigating that and reading what, Harry Bridges and all those guys who were involved in it was that there comes a point in the struggle where, as you just said, people aren't afraid anymore. They just don't care. You can shoot them, they don't care. You can beat them up, they don't care. And when a movement and folks get to that point where they just don't care anymore because they're desperate, then you're going to see real change. Yeah. I think that's coming, not tomorrow, but certainly the direction for the reasons I gave, within the next decade or two. I think we'll see it. Those of you who are younger, we'll see it. And as you said, be prepared. Don't wait for it to happen.
Isn't that sort of where Hong Kong is now?